All right, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Kate and Scott, for those intriguing presentations about the science behind the status of our water supply and the changes that we've seen over the past decade, and of course, trying to contemplate what's in store for the future of water resources for the tribes in particular, and how it impacts our first foods, river vision, and those things that they referred to earlier. Again, good morning. I'm John Barkley. I'm chair of the Tribal Water Commission for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I've been on this commission for about 26 years now, and had the privilege to sit with a number of elders. Some are no longer with us on this commission, and have served as mentors for me and various commission members who have served over the time. Governance of water is very important, and we go back as far as when the reservation homeland was established with the Treaty of 1855. It was mentioned about the Aboriginal lands of 6.4 million acres in eastern Oregon and southeast Washington, and that we tribal members essentially effectuate their treaty rights throughout this area. Even beyond that, going back to Wyoming, Montana to hunt for buffalo, for example. We have about 3,150 tribal members and are the largest employer in Eastern Oregon. The tribes adopted a tribal water code back in 1981 when the Board of Trustees, the tribal governing body, adopted that. And it was an interim code at the time. Of course, the code reflects the traditions, the culture, and values of our tribal people. And the foundation of our culture and cited in the water code is Tumunwit, or Creator's Law, which is both religion and law. And it states that water is medicine. Water is medicine to our people and to everybody. And some of the recitals in the introduction part of our code, I'd like to just, you see them there in front of you. It is the respect of all aspects of Indian life, and it is the way of life. We must share water with all living things. It is essential for the survival of all life. Cold, clean water is the lifeblood of the land. Chush, as we call it, cleanses and heals our bodies. The purpose of the code is involving water management, allocation, and development, which shall benefit the Confederated Tribes, its members and residents, and promote the purposes for which the reservation was created, to provide a permanent homeland for the members of the Confederated Tribes, protect the exclusive fishing rights as set forth in the Treaty of 1855, and preserve the cultural and religious integrity of its members. So, as Scott alluded to earlier about the potential impacts associated with climate change upon our treaty resources, particularly salmon, is very precarious and something that we take very seriously, because we've enjoyed some good times fishing out here in the Umatilla Basin. A few years ago, about over 7,000 were in the system, and but the last 2 years it hasn't been as good. Also, continuing with these purpose, it's to provide an orderly system to sustain and develop water resources, and to ensure that our residents have adequate quantity of clean water for domestic purposes, and it's to protect the water resources from over-appropriation, pollution, contamination, degradation, and other acts to the quantity and quality of water on the reservation. These are very essential because as we've experienced and are faced with, is that there is a considerable competition for water. And as Kate alluded to earlier, water is a finite resource. There's only so much to go around. To understand what that supply, that quantity is, and how we can best manage and utilize it for our values and interests is certainly based on the science that we have and are gathering, to make sure that we follow these caveats that are outlined in the purpose of this code. Again, to protect and conserve the quality and quantity of natural cultural resources in the stream zones, and ensure that the water rights reserved pursuant to the treaty receive the first priority in use and appropriation, protected and developed for the benefit of current and future generations of tribal members, and that the tribes retain full management authority over all reserved water rights sufficient to satisfy the purpose of the treaty and the homeland and members of the tribes. It is important that in the context of the tribes that we have been pursuing a tribal water rights settlement for the past decade now, and we're getting close to the cusp of completing our negotiations with the various stakeholders or parties involved in it, but it is an important element of the tribes in that since 1855 we have never quantified or settled our water rights, which is ironic in the sense that we're the first inhabitants of this area and have been around for a while. The code also cites jurisdiction of the tribes, its sovereignty, of course, that we possess inherent sovereignty to govern the use of water within the reservation boundary. The authority, of course, is coming from our tribes, and we also have some provisions in the Clean Water Act and that relates to the waters within the exterior boundaries. I want to talk about that a little later. And then the jurisdiction, again, to hear, review, and decide issues brought forth pursuant to the provisions of the code and applicable regulations. There is a civil authority in ruling on matters arising under the code, in which the Umatilla Tribal Court has the authority to assess and collect civil penalties, and actually will review and hear these cases as they come. So again, our jurisdiction up to our tribal court to help resolve any issues. There's also, of course, as with a number of areas that the tribes are engaged in, policy is always set to drive us and give us a sense of direction as to, why are we doing these things and what direction we're taking with it. But in our policy, it covers a number of areas that are segmented down, and I'm not going to elaborate on individual specifics in these areas, but they include the use of waters permitted by the tribes, goals of water management, treaty water rights, use of water without waste, water conservation required. I think it's one of the things that we emphasize is that let's not waste water. Let's conserve it as much as possible. Use it, of course, very methodically in the sense, as Kate alluded to earlier. We don't need to deplete our aquifer as we have seen in the lower Umatilla Basin. So we want to protect that groundwater because essentially we rely 100% on groundwater out here for our consumptive needs. We also groundwater conservation, competition for water, well interference, water use for development on the reservation. And as you see that we are growing. We are one of the largest employers. We have 4 primary entities in the governance, Wild Horse, our Yellowhawk, and Cayuse Technologies with over 1,700 employees. We're looking at, of course, expanding in the future. We have a well number 6 that's coming online here in the near future that will help meet our increasing needs for water out here. We also want to, of course, reserve water for human consumption, provide water for fish and wildlife resources. As I said earlier in our introduction, that water is for all living things. Protection, provide water for wetland resources. Wetlands, of course, are a valued component in any system, in any basin, and we certainly want to protect those, if not enhance them, for the benefits of our treaty resources. We also want to protect stream flows and stream zones to make sure they're not impacted or degraded, to ensure that we always have the quality there needed for our needs. We also have watershed protection, water quality, anti-degradation policies, pollution and contamination prohibited, pollution prevention. And we do that with our water quality standards, and very important that we continue to protect the quality of water out here. And then intergovernmental cooperation and coordination. As you know, that anytime that we're addressing water issues, that not just on the reservation, but proximate to the reservation, and of course within our Aboriginal lands, that 6.4 million acres, anything occurring out there impacting those water resources, the quality of it, the supply of it, we want to make sure that we have a voice in there too, and that these various stakeholders and intergovernmental agencies certainly are cognizant of what our values are, where we intend to go with water issues out here. And as cited by former Chairman Anton Minthorn, that what we do is good for everybody else, good for America, as he said. We've had a number of other legislative acts since 1981 involving our Board of Trustees, a tribal governing body, that enacted those tribal water quality standards back in September 1999, and that we enforced Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. Back in 2001, the Environmental Protection Agency formally determined that the tribes qualified for what is called treatment as a state status. And in 2001, the EPA approved our tribal water quality standards. And that's a big step for the tribes, in that the commission is tasked with making sure that we protect, if not introduce features that enhance water quality. The quality standards are not integrated in the revised code, but the code treats them as regulations under the authority of the Water Commission. And the Board of Trustees did enact a new water code, a more comprehensive water code, back in 2003. And then here just recently, this year, we had to make some amendments involving some emergency stream zone alterations in light of all the flooding that we've experienced here, as Kate and Scott alluded to. This past spring, we saw a short window of snowpack in our mountains, and we're seeing considerable melting and runoff up to over, I believe at one stage at the Mission Bridge this past year, we had about 11,000 CFS of water almost hitting the underneath of the bridge structure itself, to the point that ODOT was there, Oregon Department of Transportation, ready to shut down that bridge. But what we're seeing and experiencing is definitely less snowpack, less window up there, earlier runoff, and especially when it comes down in that quantities, how does that impact water supply when our salmon are running, for example? Those are very serious considerations, and because we're going to have to adapt and adjust to these changes, and certainly incorporate and reflect those changes in our water code. Our commission consists of 5 members: the chair, vice chair, secretary, and 2 members. They're appointed by the Board of Trustees to 2-year terms. At least 1 board member sits on the commission, and as I mentioned, we do address a considerable amount of issues on and off the reservation. One example is Walla Walla River Basin. Our commission is very engaged with what's called the Walla Walla Watershed Management Partnership Board, the Walla Walla Watershed Council, and Milton Free Water. And of course, we've been involved in a number of other governmental stakeholder interests in making sure we respectively address water issues and make sure that, well, the water is going to be there, and that we don't do anything to diminish that quality or supply. I mentioned the tribal water rights settlement earlier. As far as I'm concerned, this is probably the second most important historical event in the history of the tribes, only following the Treaty of 1855. But this has been an effort ongoing. I can recall back as early as 2000, 2001, where we've looked at water supply issues and what came about in the late 1988 and in the mid 1990s. We were able to get the Umatilla Basin project in the lower Umatilla River Basin, in which irrigators were able to forego live in-stream flows or stored flows, and in return get that balance from the Columbia River. And what that does is enable us to free up water for fisheries, and we were able to introduce salmon back into this basin in the 1990s, and been an incredible success story since then. And so it's important, as we see that our water code will of course require amendments that reflect and incorporate some of the provisions of that settlement. And it's going to be very important for our tribes, because that water is used for domestic, commercial, municipal, and industrial needs. As we develop, groundwater is really our only source, and so we're very sensitive to make sure that we maintain that equilibrium in our water tables and preserve and protect it for future generations. If anything, part of our values here is that we not only want this water that we've enjoyed for the past 7 generations, its quality and the quantity there, but also for 7 generations ahead. And if anything, you know, the elders that I've enjoyed in the past on these issues, one thing that they emphasize is that we need cold, clean, pure water. And when you have that, it certainly makes it very broad in the sense of how I can use that water, its availability. And so, you know, it's important. We don't do a lot of agriculture or farming or irrigating with water resources out here on the reservation. Nonetheless, though, we are growing and have other economic development plans in place. And anything that we do in the future is always going to require water. And so the regulation, management, and administration of that is very important, because as I mentioned, or as I started, that it reflects those values and traditions and the culture of the tribes. And again, back to Tamunwit, that this is about water for everybody. So I'm going to, I got one more here. I want to again touch on groundwater that Kate did in her presentation. You know, this is one area that is very important, because as I mentioned, if we rely 100% on groundwater, we don't divert Umatilla water or any other in-stream flows, treat it, put it in the aquifer, for example, like the city of Pendleton does. So we got to be very mindful about how we manage groundwater out here and protect the aquifers. And we saw that critical groundwater depletion that occurred in the lower basin because of what we think is poor management. And it only created a pressure and dependency on ion flows from the Columbia River. And that, again, comes with its own set of problems surrounding the Columbia River, because there are many interests involved in that river. We are very engaged with other departments here with the tribes, for example, like our public works. They are researching a new wastewater system and recycling water, something that we think is essential, because conservation and using wastewater is being done out there, and how we can replicate that for the benefit and reduce that need on groundwater is something that we need to look at. And we currently have 5 wells that serve the community, and number 6 is coming online soon. That will service water for our resort properties and the South Coyote Business Park, where we're building a building right now, and that well will come online and provide service to those properties down there that is essential for the tribes. So overall, regulating water is a very important part of the tribes' governance here. It goes right along with everything else that we oversee and manage and regulate. Again, it all starts with water, and I certainly want to commend those leaders and elders of the past who've been involved with this, and I certainly appreciate the staff that we have and the members that serve on this. And I just want to go back to Anton's words of, boy, I'm going to go back 25, 30 years on this, but you know, it all starts with our comprehensive plan too. The tribes did that back in the late 70s, and it identifies what are those values, what's important to the tribes. And of course, water comes out much on top, and you know, Anton and a number of other people have been at the forefront of these issues when they were tenuous at the time, especially when it led to the advent of the Umatilla Basin Project. And again, goes to show that we're just not engaged here on the reservation controlling what we have, but we're out there engaged with a number of stakeholders, interest groups, governmental agencies, to make sure that we are all on the same page about how we manage, how we regulate water. And that's going to be even more important as we are dealing with this climate change issues. And again, I really thank everybody for participating in this, and thank Colleen for helping putting this on, because this is a very important topic that our future generations are going to have to deal with. And how we set the table and prepare for that, of course, is very important. That we got to be sensitive and cognizant of all the needs out there, but again, still following those caveats that are laid out in our treaty, in our water code, in our 1949 Constitution and bylaws of the tribes. So we have our marching orders, and that's what we do. And so I think the biggest challenge that we're going to see, especially after seeing Scott's presentation, is how are we going to adjust and adapt to climate change when we see a smaller window of snowpack and these floods coming down. You know, how do we capture that, and how do we retain that water so that we can use it, you know, throughout the season for other needs, the fisheries and other needs that are out there. So with that, again, one thing I'm reminded of, again, is from the elders, is that the water needs to be cold, clean, and pure. Thank you. That's what I got for now, and